Okay, I think it's time to start. We're very glad and honored to have as our guest today with us Michael Lebowitz, who is not only a very important theoretician, but has also been an advisor to the Chavez government for 6 years. Michael has written a number of very interesting and important books. Beyond Capital, I consider to be one of the most relevant and original contemporary advances in market theory. But recently also, Michael has been researching and writing several books on socialism, on the socialist alternative, on conceptions of socialism for the 21st century, and so on. Michael's talk today is called Spectres and Struggles. And without further ado, I would give the word to Michael himself. But before that, only one more notification. We need you to sign this for our founders. So, thank you, and Michael, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, David. I'm trying to remember the last time I was actually in a classroom because I sort of retreated and escaped from that a number of years ago. I took retirement and early retirement because I was very frustrated not having the time to write, and also not very happy with the students who just were there for grades and had very little interest in the courses I was really teaching. So the grand plan that I had with a number of other people was to set up a storefront university to teach militants and trade unionists, etc., like that. It never happened because through a very complicated, complex set of circumstances, I ended up for 7 years actually in Venezuela. Which was a fantastic learning experience, and a lot of the work I've done in the last few years reflects, that whole process, and I'll talk a bit about that at the end. So first, let me thank CRS for the invitation. I met some of these friends 3 years ago at the Subversives, and so I'm delighted to see them again, and also to visit Zagreb again, and which I used to visit occasionally in the 80s when I would go regularly to the Socialism in the World conferences in Savtat, and then sort of go from there to different places. Today's talk takes up two themes. One is on the concept of fairness and the response to what people feel is violations of what they think is fair and just. And I gave a talk exactly 1 year ago in Canada with the title, The Concept of Fairness, Possibility, Limitations, Possibilities. And I'll want to return to some of those themes. But there's a second theme that I want to take up, and that's the need for a vision. One of the things I constantly say, and it really disturbs people that I keep repeating it, which is to comment on the old saying, which is that if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. And I've been arguing and insisting that if you don't know where you're going, no road will take you there. In other words, you need a vision. And in particular, I would argue that we need a vision of socialism, something which is an alternative to capitalism, but a different kind of socialism for the 21st century, which is also an alternative to the experiences of the 20th century. So my talk, as Stipe said, is called Spectres and Struggles. A specter is haunting the working class of Europe, both East and West, and the working class of developed capitalism in general. And that specter is the specter of communism. For the working class, that frightful hobgoblin is a society of little freedom, a society of workers without power in the workplace or community, and a society whose decisions are made at the top by a vanguard party which views itself as the sole repository of truth. Of course, this is not what communism meant for Marx and Engels, nor indeed for Lenin. For the visionaries of the 19th century, communism was a society which would foster human development, a society, in Marx's words, in which, quote, objective wealth is there to satisfy the worker's own need for development, close quote. But now in the 21st century, it's not the 19th century dream that the working class thinks about. Rather, it is an experience of the 20th century. That memory, both real and exaggerated, has seized the minds of masses. It acts, therefore, as a material force not easily dissolved by the mantra, communism, communism, chanted by philosophers and other magicians of the word. And therein lies today's tragedy. Despite the intensification of capital's class war against the working class, despite capital's insistence that workers must bear the burden of capital's own failures, the working class sees no alternative than to try to say no. No to cutbacks, no to austerity, no to new user charges, no to the destruction of our lives and our environment, but not yes to a socialist alternative. Faced with the living nightmare of 21st century capitalism, workers have seen no apparent alternative other than to mitigate the damage individually or collectively. That is the tragic result of the destruction of the dream of socialism that occurred in the 20th century. We need a new vision, a new dream. As Hugo Chavez declared in Porto Alegre in 2005, we have to reinvent socialism. But where does that vision come from, and how will it displace the specter of 20th century communism? It will not spring full-grown from the fair forehead of Zeus. Rather, the starting point for the development of a vision of a socialist alternative can only come from the struggles of resistance of working people themselves against capital's assault. Such struggles, as Marx understood, are indispensable. They are the only means of preventing, in Marx's words, workers, quote, from becoming an apathetic, thoughtless, more or less well-fed instruments of production, close quote. Indeed, he continued in another work, a heartbroken, a weak-minded, a worn-out, unresisting mass, close quote. However, Marx also understood that in themselves, such struggles are inherently conservative rather than revolutionary. There's a reason that people struggle. They do so when their sense of fairness is violated. Sometimes, of course, they don't struggle. They grumble over unfairness and injustice, but conclude that there's no alternative and accordingly focus upon individual escapes and exits. And yet there's a well-known pattern of struggles related to a sense of unfairness and justice. Referring to social norms and beliefs as to right and wrong, E.P. Thompson introduced the concept of the moral economy of the poor. In his classic article called The Moral Economy of the English Crowd in the 18th Century, Thompson argued that the food riots of the 18th century reflected a broad and passionate consensus on what was right, leading then to a sharp reaction to egregious violations of that concept of justice. And commenting on Thompson's account, a recent analyst of worker protests in China, Li Jun, observed that, quote, those rioters were legitimized by the belief that they were defending traditional rights or customs that were supported by the wider consensus of the community, close quote. Similarly, in his work on the moral economy of the peasant, James Scott focused upon the notion of economic justice among peasants and pointed to revolts and rebellions which could erupt when notions of fairness were violated. But what were those notions of fairness? For Scott, these conceptions of justice had their roots in the need for maintaining subsistence rather than opposition to exploitation as such. The test for the peasant, Scott proposed, is more likely to be what is left than how much is taken. From this perspective, exploitation in itself does not generate riots, revolts, and rebellions. Moral economist, one writer, Jeffrey Kopstein, who did a study of worker resistance in East Germany, moral economists posit, quote, the existence of a tacit social contract in almost every long-standing social formation in which subaltern groups tolerate their own exploitation. And he argued, these groups, close quote, these groups tolerate that exploitation as long as they are left enough for themselves. In other words, are able to secure their expected subsistence. But when the prevailing norm is violated, Kopstein proposed that it generates, quote, resistance ranging from shirking, grumbling, foot-dragging, false compliance, dissimulation, and other weapons of the weak, to open strikes and other forms of collective action. But for what purpose? Only to negate the violation, only to get back to the good old days. According to moral economists, Kopstein reported, quote, exploited groups simply want to restore their previous standards before the downturn. Rarely do they try to overturn the existing order altogether, close quote. So the underlying concept then is one of equilibrium. And that's a concept that Thompson employed explicitly in talking about, quote, a particular set of social relations, a particular equilibrium between paternalist authority and the crowd, close quote. When that equilibrium is disturbed, there's a feedback mechanism. Masses, peasants, crowd, workers react to the violation, and they attempt to restore the conditions corresponding to the social norms supported by the consensus of the community. Thus, all other things equal, there's a tendency towards stability with fluctuations, but always this tendency to return to the norm. We can see this experience in real socialism, or the actually existing socialism of the latter part of the 20th century. That was a term introduced in Germany and in East Germany to distinguish the real experience from merely theoretical ideas of what socialism was about. In what has been described as the social contract characteristic of real socialism, workers had definite expectations as to their entitlement. They expected rising income over time, subsidized necessities, relative egalitarianism, and especially job rights. Not only the guarantee of a job, which was supported by a full employment policy, but also protection from any changes in their existing jobs which they did not want. In return, workers accepted the rule of the vanguard in the workplace and society and comprehensive restrictions upon any power, in fact, restrictions on any initiatives from below. Now, I should stress that when talking about real socialism, where they had full employment, where they had all these characteristics, I'm talking primarily about Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, etc., and I distinguish that from market self-management of Yugoslavia, of the former Yugoslavia. So with respect to these expectations on the part of workers in real socialism, Boris Kagarlitsky, a Russian economist, commented, quote, there was a system of mutual obligations. We use the term obligatory social contract or asymmetrical social contract, meaning that the population was forced into this social contract. The social contract was definitely not free. On the other hand, if you lived in the country, you understood that though the population was forced into the contract, it was accepted, not just because there was no other way, but because people liked certain aspects of the contract, close quote. In other words, the right of everyone to subsistence and a growing standard of life, the importance of stable prices and full employment, the orientation toward egalitarianism and thus low income differentials, all these were part of the norms which formed part of the moral economy of the working class in real socialism. And while that social contract did not exclude exploitation, it did yield something that workers wanted. Kopstein argued, for example, in his study, that, quote, along with job security, East German workers had the power to demand a rough and ready sort of wage egalitarianism and consumer prices that remained low relative to wages, close quote. And that same argument for a moral economy of the working class within real socialism was, and the support that for workers that the social contract provided is explicit in Li Jun's examination of strikes in China. And he said, quote, simply put, in the Chinese socialist setting, workers view themselves as having a relationship with the state, a relationship which operates according to the norm of reciprocity. The state is expected to have committed itself to ensuring that the workers have a decent living by providing job security and a prodigious welfare package, while workers in return advocate the party ruling by giving their political support and loyalty to the state. To support, close quote, to support what Li Jun calls the workers' moral economy in China, it was expected that the state authority would fulfill, quote, its responsibility to benefit and protect its working class in the form of the iron rice bowl. In other words, everyone was looked after. What occurred in real socialism when this popular consensus of justice and fairness was violated? According to the Hungarian economist János Kornai, when this occurred, a process of feedback tended to restore the equilibrium. When the economy, he said, generates, quote, results which deviate from existing norms, the result of habit, convention, tacit or legally supported social acceptance or conformity, close quote, the system generates signals which are fed back into the system. Kornai argued that the central decision makers in Hungary had as a target a normal rate of growth of real consumption per head of 3 to 4%, with the result that, quote, if the growth of consumption remains below its normal rate, the scale of investment will be reduced so as to leave more of the national income for consumption, close quote. And it was clear to Kornai why those at the top acted this way. He said they were limited by what the population is content to accept and where dissatisfaction begins, because there was a potential cost of violating those commonly accepted norms. Quote, holding back increases in living standards or their absolute reduction and infringing the lower limit sooner or later entails serious political and social consequences, tensions, and even shocks which after a shorter or longer lag force a correction, close quote. In short, what Kornai was saying is, behind the attempt of the vanguard to avoid deviations from the norm was the anticipation that workers wouldn't be happy if that happened, that they would respond, for example, to rising prices. People, Kornai stated, wanted price stability, quote, and after a time, they even expect the government to guarantee it. Any important price increase gives rise to unrest, close quote. So Kornai argued that those at the top were limited. The barrier, quote, depends on the actual socio-political system, what level and growth rate of consumption the population is content to accept, and where dissatisfaction begins. And if there is dissatisfaction, at what point it starts to endanger the stability of the system. It is a historical fact that unrest may be so great that it induces leaders to change economic policy, end of quote. So we can see, looking at real socialism, that the moral economy of the working class was reinforced during this period by the honoring of the existing social contract. Those at the top understood that people would respond to perceived violations of the social contract, as they did in riots in 1962 in the Soviet Union in response to price increases. And they took those potential responses into account in their actions. When ideas grasp the minds of masses, Marx noted, ideas are a material force. And when people struggle to reverse violations of their concepts of right and wrong, those concepts are clearly a material force rather than disembodied ideas. And yet, the example of real socialism points to the real limits of that moral economy. It demonstrates that concepts of fairness and of a consensus of what is right and what is wrong are not sufficient to prevent their violation. After all, in real socialism, the social contract which embodied and reinforced that moral economy of the working class was not merely unfulfilled in some respect. On the contrary, it was unilaterally revoked by the vanguard. And rather than this leading to resistance by the working class to restore the social contract, there was apparently no appreciable resistance to the ending of the social contract, whether on the part of workers, whether that was in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, China, or to date, Cuba, where the same process is happening. And this problem is not simply a particular characteristic of real socialism. After all, consider what happened to the moral economy of the poor that E.P. Thompson talked about. That particular set of social relations, that particular equilibrium between paternalist authority and the crowd that he described also came to an end. As in the case of real socialism, Thompson observed that, quote, the nature of things which had once made imperative, at least in times of dearth, at least some symbolic solidarity between the rulers and the poor, now dictated solidarity between the rulers and the employers of capital, close quote. And if we add to these cases the experience in the developed capitalist world in the period after World War II, when the so-called Golden Age and the Capital Labor Accord were dissolved from the top without serious resistance from the working class, there appears to be a definite pattern. and that is, in every tacit social contract based merely upon inherited concepts of fairness, the quote, subaltern groups, that's not my kind of language, the subaltern groups cannot prevent the social contract from being abandoned entirely by those who rule. In short, the equilibrium characteristic of an existing moral economy is only an apparent one which reflects the balance of forces or the correlation of forces, which in my book, Beyond Capital, I've represented by the variable of the degree of separation among workers. To understand the limitations of moral economy, it's useful to go back and look at what Marx talked about when he talked about, not using that term moral economy, but when he talked about struggles in the 19th century. The spontaneous concepts of fairness characteristic of workers in 19th century capitalism. Marx understood that the attitudes and notions of moral economy exist at the surface of society. Rather than revealing the actual relations, they reflect how things appear and may necessarily appear to the real actors. Everyday life spontaneously produces the ideas that grasp the minds of masses and underlie their actions. After all, what did workers in mid-19th century Europe struggle about? In his work, Value, Price, and Profit, Marx observed that 99% of wage struggles followed changes that had led wages to fall. They were responses. Quote, in a word, he noted, they were reactions of labor against the previous action of capital. In short, end quote, those struggles, wage struggles, were an attempt to restore, quote, the traditional standard of life which was under attack. The spontaneous impulse of workers under these conditions, accordingly, was to struggle for fairness against the violation of existing norms, indeed to fight a guerrilla war against effects initiated by capital. The explicit goal of workers, Marx noted, was to struggle for, quote, and this was the slogan of the period, a fair day's wage for a fair day's work. In doing so, they were not attempting to change the system, nor indeed struggling against exploitation, except insofar as they thought of exploitation as unfairness. Accordingly, Marx accurately described the demands of workers embodied in a fair day's work for a fair day's wage, as conservative. That was a conservative perspective, and he argued that instead of those demands for fairness, they, quote, ought to inscribe on their banner the revolutionary watchword, abolition of the wages system, end of quote. Yet Marx understood quite well why the workers' slogan focused upon fair wages and a fair workday. That slogan flows from the necessary appearance of a transaction in which the worker yields the property right to use her capacity to work, in other words, her labor power, for a given period. And Marx said, well, on the surface of bourgeois society, he said in Capital, the worker's wage appears as the price of labor, as a certain quantity of money that is paid for a certain quantity of labor. Thus, the conscious struggle of workers is over the fairness of that certain quantity of money and the fairness of that certain quantity of labor. What is perceived as just and fair is that they receive an equivalent for their labor. In other words, that they're not cheated in terms of their normal standard. And that follows from the way the wage necessarily appears. From the form of the wage as the payment for a given workday, Marx commented, quote, comes all the notions of justice held by both the worker and the capitalist, end of quote. And he said, nothing is easier to understand than the necessity, the raison d'etre of this form of appearance, that form of appearance which underlies the moral economy of the working class in capitalism. In short, that appearance was not an accident, nor was the moral economy of workers based upon appearances an accident. On the surface, the worker sells her labor to the capitalist. However, that form of appearance, and this is Marx again from Capital, quote, makes the actual relation invisible and indeed presents to the eye the precise opposite of that relation, close quote. Specifically, it appears as if there is no exploitation, as if there is no division of the workday into necessary and surplus labor. Rather, all labor appears as paid labor, precisely because the forms of appearance are reproduced directly and spontaneously as current and usual modes of thought. This is from Marx. the essential relation must first be discovered by science. Quote. In other words, at the level of appearances, we cannot understand capitalism. Marx said, quote, the interconnection of the reproduction process is not understood. So he rejected an idea of looking at individual commodity transactions and instead examined the structure of capitalism. He asked, what is the nature of the system and how is it reproduced? And that's the central question in Capital. Considering workers as a whole, Marx assumed that in return for yielding the capitalists the use of their capacities, workers receive their traditional standard of life, what is necessary to reproduce themselves as wage laborers in a given time and a given place. And that concept of a given level of necessity, which is the basis for the whole concept of the value of labor power, allowed him to demonstrate how the workday is divided into necessary labor and surplus labor, and how the exploitation of workers is the necessary condition for the reproduction of capital. For that deduction, an absolutely critical deduction though, Marx did not have to explain the basis for this existing standard of necessity. He simply assumed it is given, and he said, this is an assumption I will remove in my book on wage labor. And with that approach, Marx was able to reveal the nature of capital and its inherent tendencies, something that a focus on appearances can never yield, the pattern of necessary tendencies. So the case was made for the necessity to end capitalist relations of production rather than to struggle for fair wages. How else could we understand what capital is without the critique of those forms of appearance which underlie the moral economy of the working class? Indeed, the apparent relation of exchange between capitalist and worker strengthens the rule of capital. Quote, it mystifies the actual relation and, quote, ensures the perpetuation of a specific relation of dependency, endowing it with this deceptive illusion of a transaction, close quote, again from Marx and Capital. To enable workers to go beyond that conservative motto to the revolutionary watchword, Marx offered the weapon of critique, a critique based on an alternative political economy, the political economy of the working class. However, understanding the nature of the system as the source of the anger and unhappiness of people is not a sufficient condition for going beyond the system. I mean, that intellectual understanding of what capitalism is not enough. For people whose sense of fairness has been violated, the vision of an alternative is necessary. An alternative that can appear to workers as a new common sense, as their common sense. Like the worst architect, and this is, sort of basically drawing upon something Marx has to say, like the worst architect for the revolutionary labor process, we must build the goal in our minds before we can construct it in reality. Only that conscious purpose can ensure the purposeful will that is necessary. Rather than the abstract proletarians which are characteristic of bad theory, the starting point should be real people with real particular ideas and concepts that are reflected in an existing moral economy. By considering current social norms and belief as to what is right and what is wrong, we can avoid the tendency to begin with a preconceived theory and see nothing else. As we can see, the existing concept of fairness, as reflected in the moral economy of the working class, are seriously limited. The spontaneous tendency of moral economy is to look backward. Characteristic is the attempt to restore a previous equilibrium, either an immediate one or an idealized one from the past. It's a vision of the past rather than a vision for the future. However, for revolutionaries who would help to put an end to existing structures of exploitation and deformation, it's essential to recognize the importance of the moral economy of the working class and to go beyond it. To see the future in the present is what is needed if we are to build that future. To articulate what is implicit in current concepts and struggles is essential for the development of a conscious vision of a new society. Consider, for example, what was characteristic of real socialism. In the book, The Contradictions of Real Socialism, I identified 3 elements in the moral economy of the working class and real socialism that contain implicitly within them characteristics of an alternative society, a society of associated producers. In the orientation of workers toward egalitarianism, we can see glimpses of one such characteristic, the focus upon the common ownership of the means of production, which implies the right to share equally as owners. And as the repeated exhortations of the vanguard against egalitarianism, calling it petty bourgeois egalitarian, etc., like that, that sense of entitlement had real lasting power in the minds of workers. Workers believed in equality, but what underlies equality except common ownership of the means of production? Further, solidarity of workers within their individual workplaces in real socialism, as manifested in their mutual support in protecting each other against managers, and through their spontaneous cooperation in making production possible, generated a sense of their collective power and latent support for workers' control. Just as the spontaneous food riots of the 18th century revealed the underlying moral economy of the crowd, so also does the spontaneous emergence of workers' councils, as in Hungary in 1956 and Poland in 1980, allow us to infer the existence of an underlying consensus among workers. And this orientation toward worker management was acknowledged by the vanguard itself when it sought to shore up support for its role, as in Yugoslavia in 1950, Czechoslovakia in 1968, and initial gestures in perestroika. Finally, within that moral economy was a tendency to help each other without demanding an equivalent in return. An economy of favors is how one writer, Ledinova, described the Soviet Union. Rather than relations in which alienated, mutually indifferent individuals exchange alienated things, characteristic of real socialism is the presence of gift relations among networks of friends and family. And that gift work, she noted, is, quote, created and preserved by a mutual sense of fairness and trust, close quote. It presumes people who have a bond, people who have a past and hope to have a future, and its product is the enhancement of solidarity within these small networks of people. In this third element of the moral economy of the working class and real socialism, one can argue there is latent a society based on solidarity and community, one where we support others to the best of our ability. Three glimpses of an alternate society present within real socialism, but only glimpses, isolated appearances of an hidden alternative structure. And as long as they remain isolated and unarticulated, as integral parts of a whole, they appear simply as anomalies and inefficiencies in a society, a structure dominated by a different logic. From the perspective of the logic of the vanguard and the logic of capital, which were the two contesting logics which made real socialism dysfunctional, these elements within the moral economy of the working class were irrational. They were vestiges of peasant society. They were anti-proletarian. They were opposed to the development of the productive forces. In the absence of a theory that articulated the logic of the working class, bringing in these elements and showing their combination and unity, that implicit alternative was and continues to be easily defeated. But that logic can be articulated. In the moral economy of the working class and real socialism, we can glimpse three sides of what I identified in the book, The Socialist Alternative, as the organic system of socialism, and which Hugo Chavez called in 2007 the elementary social triangle. Social ownership of the means of production, social production organized by workers, and production for social needs and purposes. By making explicit the characteristics of this particular combination of production, distribution, and consumption, it's possible to present a coherent vision that transcends the existing moral economy, a vision that can be a weapon in struggle precisely because it is an explicit rejection of the specter of 20th century communism. That's why Chavez's call to reinvent socialism in his closing speech at the World Social Forum in 2005 at Porto Alegre was so significant. He said, we must reinvent socialism. It can't be the kind of socialism that we saw in the Soviet Union, he stressed, but it will emerge as we develop new systems that are built on cooperation, not competition. If we're ever going to end, these are quote, the poverty of the majority of the world, capitalism must be transcended, quote, but we cannot resort to state capitalism, which would be the same perversion of the Soviet Union. We must reclaim socialism as a thesis, a project, and a path, but a new type of socialism, a humanist one, which put humans and not machines or the state ahead of everything, end of quote. That speech pointed, in short, to a different concept, to a vision of socialism for the 21st century. Rather than expansion of the means of production or direction by the state, it asserted that human beings must be at the center of the new socialist society. And that perspective reveals a return to Marx's vision, to the contrast that Marx drew in Capital between a society subordinate to the logic of capital, quote, where the worker exists to satisfy the needs of the existing values for valorization, close quote, and the logic of a new society, quote, that inverse situation in which objective wealth is there to satisfy the worker's own need for development. There's an important concept, the worker's own need for development that Marx is talking about there. There is more, though, at the core of this concept of socialism for the 21st century. It's also a return to Marx's understanding that human development requires practice. It's a return to his understanding of the centrality of what he called revolutionary practice, the concept of, quote, the coincidence of the changing of circumstances and of human activity and self-change, close quote. With the grasping of Marx's key link, and I always stress this key link we have to look for, of human development and practice, this concept of the 21st century, of socialism for the 21st century, emphasizes our need to be able to develop through democratic, participatory, and protagonistic activity in every aspect of our lives. The concept is one of democracy in practice, democracy as practice, democracy as protagonism. And democracy in this sense, protagonistic democracy in the workplace, protagonistic democracy in neighborhoods, communities, communes, is the democracy of people who transform themselves into revolutionary subjects. Socialism for the 21st century has now emerged as a specter which haunts capitalism. For behind the many no's to neoliberalism, no's to austerity, to cutbacks, to unemployment, no's to the destruction of the environment in pursuit of profits, there is also a yes. A specter that has been articulated in Latin America and most clearly in Venezuela. That specter, though, did not drop from the sky, nor did it come from a reading of Marx or Marx's disciples. Its emergence can be traced to the effects of neoliberalism and the Washington Consensus upon Latin America in the 1980s, the lost decade, and the reaction in Venezuela with the uprising of masses in what was known as the Caracazo in 1989, and the unsuccessful military civic coup led by Chavez in 1992. The alternative began, in short, with no's, but as a result of a complex process of interaction and struggle, it became a positive goal. Once Chavez was elected president in 1998, it was possible to use the power of the existing state to chart a new direction. And this is what occurred. For example, first, a constituent assembly was convened to write a new constitution intended to change the rules of the game, a step that would inspire, in their turn, both Bolivia and Ecuador, also suffering under the rules of neoliberalism and electing governments determined to challenge that. They too went into a new process of constituent assemblies to rewrite the constitution. And in Venezuela, to that constituent assembly as participants came activists in the social movements and the remnants of guerrilla wars who had struggled for years against the policies of previous Venezuelan governments. And you can see the elements in this, in that constitution which reflect that. One of the most well-known, or not well-known, but should be well-known aspects of that constitution, for example, is the clause, a section which says, work within the household creates value and should be compensated as such. That was included that's in the Venezuelan constitution. And it's the result of a number of feminists, socialist feminists, who went to Beijing and came back and decided we have to get this into the new constitution. So all the social movements, poured all their hopes and dreams into the constitution, and the constitution they produced was one which highlighted this key link of human development and practice. For example, if we look at that constitution, in its explicit recognition that the goal of a human society must be that of, quote, ensuring overall human development, close quote, in its declaration that, quote, everyone has the right to the free development of his or her own personality, close quote, and in the focus as well upon, quote, developing the creative potential of every human being and the full exercise of his or her personality in a democratic, society. And the language is, gender, it includes both genders, it's not he throughout the Constitution. The theme of human development pervades the Bolivarian Constitution. Further, the Constitution also identified how people develop their capacities and capabilities. In other words, how overall human development occurs. The Constitution declares that participation by people in, quote, forming, carrying out, and controlling the management of public affairs is the necessary way of achieving the involvement to ensure their complete development, both individual and collective. It's the necessary way. Participation, protagonism, etc. And that same emphasis upon a democratic, participatory, and protagonistic society is present in the economic sphere, which is why the Constitution stresses, quote, self-management, co-management, cooperatives in all forms, close quote, and why the goal of, quote, developing the creative potential of every human being emphasizes, quote, active, conscious, and joint participation, close quote. This is not the language of capital, nor is it the logic of capital. On the other hand, that Constitution was not anti-capitalist in itself, because it contained within it key elements supportive of capitalism, such as the provision of autonomy for the Venezuelan central bank, which is a must for all neoliberal economic theory. Says you have to have autonomy of the central bank so finance can rule. Very simply, the Bolivarian Constitution was a snapshot of the balance of forces at that time and contained potentially contradictory or incompatible elements. It was consistent in this respect with Chavez's own initial belief that a third way between capitalism and socialism was possible. Indeed, that the enemy was neoliberalism and bad capitalism rather than capitalism as such. Chavez was saying, I believe in a third way, he didn't say a good capitalism, but he wasn't looking for socialism. Within a few years, though, Chavez's attempt to introduce reforms activated both enemies, the local oligarchy and U.S. imperialism, and supporters in the form of the Bolivarian circles, which were called for by Chavez in June 2001 and sworn in the following December, sworn in to protect the advances. So when the oligarchy, with the active support of imperialism, proceeded to remove Chavez through a coup in April 2002, the masses had a basic organization which could mobilize them in the Bolivarian circles. 2 days after it began, the coup was reversed as a result of that mobilization and of a military which overwhelmingly supported the Bolivarian Constitution. And the confidence gained in that particular struggle of reversing the coup multiplied exponentially when the masses, including organized workers who hadn't been real actors in the first, in the coup, succeeded in defeating capital's next effort to bring down the government, which was a general lockout, including of the state oil company, which was owned but not controlled by the state, and which began the following December. And this was seen as they were going to wipe Chavez out. This general saying was they started it early December, Chavez will be gone by Christmas. Why? Because all the oil revenue would be completely cut off, and that was going to sort of be the key. But also, it wasn't only the oil company. Many private companies also went on strike, shut their doors at that time, telling the workers, don't worry, it's not going to last very long. You got your wages paid throughout this whole period through this lockout. But in fact, after months of struggle and learning, The combination of actions by the government, which used the military to open up, some of the areas to allow for export of oil, and workers and communities, which organized, fuel, organized, stores, etc. Basically opened up a lot of the locked out places. What happened through that learning process, it demonstrated that combination of actions and initiatives by the state and also initiatives organized from below demonstrated Marx's point that, quote, sporadic slaveholders insurrections interrupt the work of peaceful progress, but they only accelerate the movement by putting the sword into the hand of the social revolution. And that's what happened. The defeat of the lockout attempt, enormously increased the militancy, the understanding of the population, but also transformed Chavez, seeing what had happened in this particular period. And I'll just a side little point, because it reflects a lot of the worker takeovers of industry that occurred, because what happened was many of these firms that locked out their workers ultimately failed. And the workers would, be outside the factories, et cetera, saying, where are our wages? We're not going to let you take any of the equipment out of the factories, et cetera, and then ultimately led to seizures of those factories, in which they would then run on a self-managed basis. So in any event, at this point, the general course was apparent. Chavez no longer thought of the possibility of a good capitalism. He said in late 2003, quote, "The logic of capital is a perverse logic. It doesn't care about destroying the rivers, about putting children to work, about the hunger of workers, about the malnutrition of their children. It is not interested in labor accidents, if workers eat, if they have housing, where they sleep, if they have schools, if when they get sick they have doctors, if when they are old they have a pension. No, the logic of capital cares nothing about that. It is diabolical. It is perverse." In contrast, Chavez praised what he called the social economy. The social economy, he argued, quote, "bases its logic on the human being, on work, that is to say, on the worker and the worker's family, that is to say, in the human being," close quote. And that social economy does not focus on economic gain, on use values, rather, quote, "the social economy generates mainly use value," close quote. Its purpose is, quote, "the construction of the new man, of the new woman, of the new society," end of quote. And it should be obvious that without once using the term in this period, Chavez, in talking about the social economy, was talking about socialism for the 21st century, even though he did not explicitly call for its reinvention until early 2005. That's the specter. Making that specter real over the next few years involved important steps toward building that socialist triangle of social ownership, social production, and the satisfaction of social needs. In particular, substantial state revenues were directed to remedy the enormous inherited social deficit in health and education, and more recently housing, through special missions that bypassed the traditional state structures. That was one aspect of the focus on meeting social needs. But the Bolivarian process involved much more than delivering presents from above. Local committees were central to the work of the new missions, and that you would have, for example, if you had a health mission, it would not just simply be the establishment of health facilities, which were those health facilities were the place where the Cuban doctors came. It wasn't simply that process of that. It was through the establishment of health committees in every small neighborhood, which worked very closely and organized the whole process. If you had, say, a process of trying to ensure that people would have land, a title to their land, that occurred through land committees. If you had a process of problems with water and sewerage, you had water tables. In every case, this process involved activating people from below to work, and in that process, of course, they were simultaneously transforming themselves as they transformed circumstances. So, those local committees were central to the work of the new missions, and then they were brought together through the creation in 2006 of communal or neighborhood councils. And the communal councils was created an institutional form through which people can diagnose their needs collectively and determine the priorities for their communities. And it also shifted power to people in their neighborhoods. I should point out that the communal councils in the urban areas are basically 100 to 200 families. In the rural areas, there are 20 to 50 families. And since they are so small in their numbers, they allow for major decisions to be made in a general assembly of people in the neighborhood. And one of the most striking characteristics when you go around to communal council meetings, because the communal councils then elect what they call voceros, the voices of the community in interactions with other bodies. But one of the most striking things when you look at the voceros, the people who are the most active in the communal councils, is the number of women. And it's striking that, whereas, different governmental forms where people have to leave their neighborhood to go and participate isn't what's happening in Venezuela. In the communal councils, you're just in your street, in your neighborhood. So that has enormously affected the position of women within Venezuela, so much so that I would argue that the women are the strongest Chavists, in the country. In any event, this whole process was one of shifting power to the neighborhoods. And Chavez in 2007 said, all power to the communal councils. If that sounds a little familiar, it's not by accident. That familiar ring of that call is not accidental, because in those councils, which combine with others to form communes, to which they sound, to which they send their voceros, there is the development of what Chavez called the cells of a new socialist state. In other words, he looks at the councils and said, these are the cells of the new socialist state. We will build first from the level of the councils, then we bring councils together to deal with larger problems, and those larger problems, because there are limits to what you can solve when you are dealing with a small neighborhood of 100 to 200 families. But adjoining councils, adjoining communities come together with your communal council to form communes. And that's the process that's happening right now, the formation of communes in Venezuela. And the next step that was envisioned, and presumably still envisioned, was to take the communes to form communal cities. In other words, there is a whole process involved, which is the creation of a new state from below, which is a long process, doesn't happen overnight, but nevertheless, there's a clear conception of the direction. So, what I want to suggest is that you can see the effect of this kind of development in every community. Through that process of protagonism in their communities, people are producing themselves as new subjects with dignity and a sense of entitlement, a sense of their right to decide. And it's that simultaneous changing of circumstances and self-change, which in the words of the Constitution is the necessary way to ensure their complete development, individual and collective. And a similar process of protagonism has been initiated in workplaces through the establishment and the support of cooperatives, many of them closed enterprises that have been restored, and through the development of worker-managed recovered factories, and also the creation of workers' councils in state industry. And although the success of worker management in state industry has been quite mixed, and this is I think one of the tragedies in Venezuela so far, not only because of the opposition from Chavez bureaucrats who don't want to lose any power within those state industries, but also unfortunately from economistic trade unions who are not at all interested in worker management. They're interested in higher wages only. So although the success of worker management in state industry has been mixed, the commitment to workers' control has remained. And Chavez himself declared at a televised cabinet meeting in response to initiatives from workers in July 2009 that what Venezuela had now was state capitalism, and you can't have socialism without workers' control, which should resonate with people who know the history of the former Yugoslavia, because that's exactly what was being said in 1950 here. Finally, characteristic of this specter is not merely opposition to privatization, but the renationalization of state firms which were privatized by previous capitalist governments. In addition to recovering real state control over the oil industry, which was a necessary premise for funding the programs which have attacked the social deficit, the Venezuelan government has restored social property in communications, electric power, the steel industry, has taken over the cement industry, which was necessary if it was going to have a substantial housing program, and has moved decisively into the banking sector. The government, in short, controls the commanding heights of the economy and has expanded as well into dairy and coffee processing and food distribution, has fostered the development of new industries like computer and cell phone manufacture, and has supported peasant seizures of land from the latifundia. Can there be any doubt that this is a specter haunting capitalism? The specter of socialism for the 21st century, though, can also serve as a dream and vision for those who are trying to say no to capital's assault. Each side of the socialist triangle relates directly to elements of current struggles. Social ownership of the means of production relates to the fight against privatization. Social production organized by workers relates to the sense of emptiness and powerlessness of life within the workplace and the community under capitalist domination. And thirdly, production for social needs it relates to the struggle against capitalist imposed austerity. By themselves, those elements represent partial rejections of existing structures. However, to the extent that they remain partial, they cannot offer a vision that goes beyond the existing moral economy. By demonstrating their interdependence within an organic socialist system, on the other hand, it's possible to offer an alternative common sense, one which contains a new sense of fairness, the potential for a new moral economy. With such a vision, there's possibility. The possibility of going beyond the limits of moral economy with its backward vision to the political economy of the working class with its focus upon a society oriented to the workers' own need for development. To make the specter of socialism for the 21st century a material force, though, it must grasp the minds of masses. And that means, first of all, that its beginnings in Latin America must be communicated around the world, which is not at all in the interest of the international capitalist press. And that is something that is why it's important for people to inform themselves as to what is happening, to seek out the alternative sources of information that are not part of the normal media. This is the battle of ideas. And in that battle, it's essential to point to this new vision. Taken as a whole, this specific combination of production, distribution, and consumption, characteristic of the organic system of socialism, points to the centrality of a focus upon human development. It points to a society in which each person can develop her full potential, a society which, in the words of the Communist Manifesto, where it is recognized that, quote, the free development of each has as its condition the free development of all, close quote. What kind of society do people want to live in? What kind of society do people want their children to live in? In the Socialist Alternative, I proposed a simple set of propositions, what I called a charter for human development, that can be recognized as self-evident requirements for human development. 1, everyone has the right to share in the social heritage of human beings, an equal right to the use and products of the social brain, the use and benefits of the products of the social brain and the social hand in order to develop his or her full potential. So everyone has that right. We have inherited an enormous amount of civilization and technology, etc. Why should it belong to specific subsets of society? 2, everyone has the right to be able to develop their full potential and capacities through democracy, participation, and protagonism in the workplace and society, a process in which these subjects of activity have the precondition of the health and education that permit them to make full use of this opportunity. And third, everyone has the right to live in a society in which human beings and nature can be nurtured, a society in which we can develop our full potential in communities based upon cooperation and solidarity. So that's what I suggested was a charter for human development. And the goal of such a charter is to try to redefine the concept of fairness, to stress that it is unfair that some people monopolize the social heritage of all human beings, that it is unfair that some people are able to develop their capacities through their activities while others are crippled and deformed, and that it is unfair that we're forced into structures in which we view others as competitors and enemies. Is it possible to redefine the concept of fairness and to build a new moral economy of the working class? Certainly it's not inevitable. We live today in capitalist barbarism. So the choice before us is familiar. It's simple: socialism or barbarism. And if our choice is to end barbarism and make the specter of socialism for the 21st century real, it will take real organization and struggle now. So that's it.
Thank you, Michael, for this excellent lecture. And we have now more than enough time for discussion. So, any questions or comments? The two?
So I have two questions. One is, what does it really mean that the women are as strong as Chavez? And the other question is, a couple of years ago when you were in Croatia, you were talking about three models or something that I constructed for myself as three models of worker self-management. One being mostly owned by the state and managed by the workers, the other is opposite, and the third one is a mixture of those two. And a couple of days ago in Ljubljana you mentioned that there are some problems with the factories that are being self-managed by the workers. So I was wondering if maybe you can say something more about what is the situation with the factories that are being self-managed by the workers in Venezuela today.
Okay.
Thank you.
Anyway, I'll take these up first. Yeah. There's a very let me just distinguish between women who are the theorists and activists, social activists, because there's been a very strong group of women who have done some fantastic organizing. I have in mind one particular person, a woman by the name of Nora Castaneda, who was one of the people who came back from Beijing and got that clause into the Constitution. She was made president of the Women's Bank by Chavez, and what she did immediately was, the initial idea was this is going to be one of those microfinance kinds of things. She immediately began, a whole process of creating a situation in which, to get funding, you have to go through extensive seminars and discussions, learning about how to run a cooperative, et cetera, and learning socialist principles. And then, out of that, an organization was formed, which was the Users of the Women's Bank, which is in fact a network throughout the whole country of women who are, very militant. As far as what's in terms of the local community, it's been. So many of the changes that have occurred have immediately impacted on women who are, who often, very, unfortunately, have most of the responsibility for their families. So you have a situation in which, suddenly health doctors were available, for the family, for the children, right in your neighborhood. Suddenly you now had, education available. So you had people learning, adult education. And I remember in 2006, we were going around to neighborhoods, and there was a whole group of grandmothers, who were learning, literacy in one of the parts of the educational process. I think it was the first level, and they were very proud, and they would tell you that they would show you something they could read and things of that sort. And they were the key militants going around knocking on door to door. Go to their classes, and in the afternoons they were going around identifying all the Chavez supporters, et cetera, like that. Those kinds of things have delivered real gains. And then there is the whole process of the communal councils, in which women feel that they can participate, and in fact, often participate. I've gone to some communal council meetings and see, where are the men? Because men were off drinking beer somewhere. The women were deciding everything, and so. Do you want anything further on that? I think they are. I think if you go, and also you find, a good representation of the women in the militias that were created by Chavez. So as far as the self-management, there have been, several of, streams. One stream was through, factories that were closed and taken over. They were taken over by cooperatives, and the workers who seized them would form a cooperative, and then would go to the state to get credit to carry on their business. Those, from what I hear, many of those are functioning successfully. There's very little state involvement, in them. Another form was a combination in which the state took 51% ownership and leaving the workers with 49%, the workers who seized the factory. And that was, I argued against it at the time because I said, why not 100% state ownership, 100% workers' control. Because I could see real problems when there's investment. Who does the investment belong to? There are all kinds of potential problems. And one of the examples of the problems that happened quite early was, here was a factory called Venipal. It was a paper-making company. It's one of the ones that failed, and the workers seized it because there was new machinery in it, and the old owners wanted to get that machinery out and sell it. The workers seized it, but this is after a long strike. And there had been, I can't remember how many people, were originally working there, but of course, in the course of the strike and the picket line, many workers sort of faded away, to find jobs to feed their, families. So it was a subset of those who originally, took over the factory, of those who were on strike who took over the factory. So you now have this situation in which, there was a company which was renamed Invapal, instead of Venipal, and it was made into a 49%, 51% split. At the Solidarity meetings of the Workers' Table in 2005, I gave a talk talking about, and some people have seen it, 7 difficult questions. In which I talk about, the difficult the problems in Yugoslav self-management, that emerged, that had to be, recognized by workers in Venezuela. They had to deal with these problems. And one of the themes I was stressing was the problem of self-interest, the self-interest of workers. Well, in Invapal, it came with a real horror, because what Invapal, when they started, operating the plant again, they hired many of the new, workers that their old comrades who worked side by side but had gone away, in order to, maintain the family for subsistence, et cetera, like that. And so this cooperative, part, I actually skipped a step. The real step before that, and the sign that things were bad, is immediately after I gave that talk, it was followed by the president of Invapal, who said, yes, we have worker management here, it's wonderful, et cetera, like that, and we have right now 49%, we should have 99%. Having a cooperative is really wonderful because you don't have to pay taxes. So there was this story of self-interest, particular self-interest immediately coming forward. I don't know, But then, in the case of Invapal, there was this story in which they hired back, as wage laborers, a whole group of the people that they had worked with before. Now, Venezuelan cooperative law says if you work for a company, for a cooperative can have wage laborers, but at the end of 6 months, they have to be incorporated in the cooperative. Okay. you can write the next part of the story, because about 5 months later, after they started work, they were all fired, in order not to be included in the cooperative. And so that's some of the kinds of problems that were happening with that particular formula of the 51 and 49%. And one of the more militant groups of workers who went through and had many educationals from a firm called, which was a valve producing firm, which was then taken over, same formula, 51, 49% called, and it was Invival. They, after extensive discussions, decided that they didn't like this at all. They didn't think it was a very good formula, so they turned back their 49% and decided they were going to run it 100% workers' control. And they, you know, they didn't want that mixed formula at all. Let me just say, all right, yeah, okay, so then we get to the other case, the state industry. One of the most dramatic, steps that Chavez did was in 2005, was he appointed as the Minister for the Economy, for the basic industry, and also as the president of a whole section of state industries in the industrial state of Bolivar, in a district called Guayana, a person who was very oriented toward worker management, and he immediately appointed a person by the name of Carlos Lanz as the president of the aluminum company called Alcasa. Now, Carlos Lanz was a very interesting person. He's probably the best Marxist in the country, and had learned a lot of his Marxism in jail after being part of a group that kidnapped an American businessman. And so he came in with the mandate of create worker management in this company. And he found within a relatively short time, you can see some of this, there's a excellent video that was done by Dario Azzolini on 5 factories, and a good portion of it is about Alcasa and Carlos Lanz. He doesn't tell the part, because I guess it came later, about how Carlos Lanz was threatened with death, and because of the mafia. You know, when you go into worker management, suddenly, you know, all the corruption issues start coming out, and the mafia was not very interested in that. So that was a disaster. It reverted back basically to management on the part of the local bureaucracy, and Carlos Lanz, left the area, safely, and although he was carrying a gun at various points, in order to protect himself. So that experiment all came to an end. Basically the whole process of worker management in that industrial area came to an end. But then there was all this struggle over the steel company. The steel company, which was owned by an Argentine, multi-conglomerate, and the workers and the steel and the company were in constant battle, and the workers were calling, as this intensified, the workers were saying, we can't deal with them, we want this. It was a privatized steel company, we want this renationalized, and that became the demand of the workers. We want nationalized steel company. And militancy was growing, and all these companies are very close by, the steel company, the aluminum company, an iron ore company, a bauxite firm, they're all next to each other, in this industrial area of Guayana. And so one of the things that happened there was that when Chavez said, okay, hearing from his vice president at the time, who said, the company is really stonewalling, they're the problem in this whole thing, Chavez said, we've got to take them over. So the workers just really delighted, et cetera, like that. And the workers immediately in that steel company began to talk about worker management. And their emphasis on worker management, and we worked closely with them, their emphasis on worker management then became a theme for all the state companies in Guayana, with the result that within a year, less than a year, there was a proposal to have, and Chavez sort of went along with it, the labor minister encouraged this, to talk about a socialist plan for Guayana. And there was a televised meeting from Guyana in which the workers' reports from 10 working tables came up, and the workers would then, one would get up and just say, our table wants this, we want this person fired, these are managers who are in fact the enemy, this company is in fact ripping us off, these, etc., these private companies, we want to nationalize them. And every one of the 10, they got more and more militant, and the workers, everybody there, just yes, 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 and so it was fantastic. And Chavez is sitting there, with like a stone face, nothing. He's just taking down his notes. And he got up, after all these things. And I have to tell you that a number of the people who were making the report for the table are people that we had worked with. When I say we, it was the Centro International Miranda, which is the institute we created, and we had, a few of us had weekly meetings with groups of workers on different subjects, one of which was creating a workers' managed plan from below. So one of the things that Chavez did at this point was say, and it's a longer story than it has to be, but it'll give you a sense of the obstacles and the problems. So the Chavez got up and he said, we're going to nationalize this firm. Yes, we're going to nationalize. And he gives all the demands. We're going to get rid of these managers, etc., like that. And it was just incredible, energy. And the workers just spontaneously broke into singing the national anthem. It was just a fantastic thing. And then Chavez said, you have to now go back and create a socialist economic plan for this area. It was understood worker management is part of this. And so that was it. The workers started working on this. They created tables, work tables, transcending individual firms. So for example, they would find a firm, which was making this input that could be output, which could be used for an input for another one of them. They were engaged in a whole process of rationalizing the industry. It was fantastic. And they brought this socialist economic plan for Guyana and sent it up to their managers. Stonewalled. Nothing happened. So this, months go by. And so that, what was happening under those circumstances was that the workers were getting restive, and they were going to, they were threatening to march on the Capitol, to march to demand of Chavez, we've done the socialist economic plan, but it's being sabotaged, etc. And so he, what happened in that situation was, Chavez had one of his open cabinet meetings, and in this televised cabinet meeting, and there we see him say, okay, what's happened to the socialist economic plan of Guyana? Where are they? What's happening? And he gets one of the minister in charge of that area at that time, is called upon. He wants to answer. He said, no, not you. Recognizing this guy was part of the problem. He then asked another minister, to answer questions. And then Chavez said at this particular point, look, what we have now is state capitalism. Without worker control, you cannot have socialism. Broadcast through the country. And so he said, I want this to proceed. And so one of the things that happened out of this was that the workers in these various companies, selected, created councils throughout and selected the person they wanted to have as president. And Chavez then came and sort of accepted those choices. And so that sounds like a wonderful story, end of story, but no. I know, for example, one of the people, I know the story in Alcasa, because which had that historic memory of trying and then failing, but now was like really pushing on these things. And in the case of Alcasa, one of the things that the person who had been very much involved in these tables found, when he and his people of the council started going through some of the contracts, they found these contracts were absolute rip-offs. They were giveaways to the purchasers, which were transnationals, and so they said, we cannot possibly run this company with this contract. We can't, because we'll be broke. We cannot possibly fund any new investment, for improving our production lines. They were horrible. I mean, this is like 19th century death, in that aluminum factory. And so he said, so we're going to cancel that contract. And so there were thing, you would expect there would be some opposition. One opposition came from, the bureaucrats. They didn't like the canceling of this contract. Another part of the opposition came from the mafia. But the most surprising part, well, maybe it's not surprising in retrospect, came from the traditional trade unions there, who in fact, blockaded the gates, saying, that this contract must be maintained. And it was, one might guess that some of the leadership of the trade unions were in fact, on the take and getting a share through that corruption. Venezuela, a long tradition of corruption and clientelism. So ultimately, the whole experiment of worker management in El Casa disappeared, and there's a constant struggle at this particular point going on right now in the steel company. So this is a struggle. Now, if you're interested in those experiences, I actually sent, I think to Mislav, a reference. What is it? The Earl, for a video that was done from a conference that I organized in my program at the center. It was a conference on worker management theory, thought, and experiences. And it brought together representatives from worker-controlled operations in Argentina, Brazil, and quite a few of them from Venezuela. And you get the testimonies of these people as to what they were doing, how, for example, a particular company related to, the communal councils in their area, what they found when they opened the books, et cetera, like that, and all of that. It's dubbed in English. And also you can get Chavez in this particular, we organize it on the logic of the socialist triangle, and you can also get then the clips of Chavez talking about the socialist triangle, this is our model, et cetera, like that. So that's lots of problems, lots of struggle, but that's, what you have. You work, you play the hand you're dealt.
Nico also had a question.
I'm a bit sorry now to go back to this historical thing, but that was my original question, so I'll stick with it. What you described as a moral economy of the crowd seems to me to be something that used to be called, a trade unionist consciousness or economist consciousness, as opposed to a different kind of consciousness, a political consciousness, necessary for the construction of socialism, necessary for revolution, etc. So, and it was considered that there is a necessity for a political organization which should then intervene in the masses so as to go from this economist consciousness of the working class to the political consciousness of the working class. And it seems to me that what you suggest is simply that needs to find a new moral economy. So do you think that this is a qualitatively different kind of consciousness, political consciousness, or did you, it would seem to me that you suggested a different kind of model, that it's just a different type of moral economy, which would mean a different standard of economist demands. So, and I'm sorry, just another question also. Concerning the strikes in 20th century socialist states, I always remember this anecdote about the first strike in the Soviet Union, if I'm not mistaken. The first strike was after the October Revolution, not in the Soviet Union. The first strike was, I think, the strike of the postal workers, which was not an egalitarian strike. It was actually quite the opposite, because the postal workers, as the remaining part of the state bureaucracy, was quite privileged.
Is this the 20s?
No, I think it's 1918. I'm very early 1918. So it was basically a struggle to keep their relatively privileged position in comparison to the peasant masses and even the industrial working class. So this is just maybe one example, but it would seem to me that maybe the contradictions is not just between the conductor, the vanguard and the moral economy of the masses, because you have the crowd is as in the examples you gave from Venezuela. There is very different conflicting class conflicts inside the masses as well as inside the vanguard, as we can see from the 20th century socialists. So it would seem that to me that this is not the only contradiction between some kind of moral economy of the working class and the vanguard. It seems to me that there is class conflict inside the room, so to say.
Well, first of all, when I say a new moral economy, it's really to say, it's not of the old type. It's to say we have to create a new sense of fairness. We have to sort of focus on not trying to restore something that we had in the past or thought we had in the past, but rather recognizing the necessity to basically get rid of capitalism in order to achieve a lot of things that are desired. So maybe you're restive over my use of the term new moral economy, but it's really a call for revolution. As far as the question of the perspective of economistic trade unions, et cetera, like that, yeah, I mean that is a problem. But again, we start from that. Then the question is, what has to happen? When I look at when I'm arguing on the whole question of the moral economy, I'm saying, look, one of the problems of so many left sectarian groups is that they have this idea of this is the proletariat in their mind, and this is what the proletariat believes, and they have a checklist. Do you do this? Do you do that? Et cetera, like that. Rather than starting from the perspective of what are people really struggling over. That I'm saying is you have to be rooted in those struggles. But of course, those struggles in themselves aren't sufficient, aren't adequate, because of what flows from them. What is necessary is to bring a political understanding, to go beyond economism, to see, and that's the term I used was to be able to see the future within the present struggles, to be able to identify how this implies something different. That clearly, does talk about a party. It's not going to happen spontaneously, but it's the concept that I'm basically arguing for is, and my wife Marta Heinecker does much more on this question than I do, is that it has to be a party that listens. That rather that comes with all the answers in its back pockets. It's a party that listens and learns. Because the tradition of Marxist, Leninist parties, et cetera, has been one of saying, all right, we have the answers, the social movements must be subordinated to us, and the real purpose of connecting with social movements is to recruit them into your vanguard. That's clearly not what has to happen. We should have learned from that experience and learn that we have to listen to what the concerns of people are and find ways to bring them together. And in the book, Build It Now, I had a section on where I explicitly talk about how else can you bring together workers who are in the advanced sectors and workers in the informal sector, workers in this area, etc. How else can you do that without a party that will articulate and bring them together and develop unity among them? So I don't know whether you implicit in your question was the idea that you'll never get. You need a party to go beyond economism, and if that's the point, in this case you're kicking through an open door, as Lenin would say.
Any more questions or comments?
I have two questions. First, could you kind of identify what are, in your view, the most challenging macroeconomic problems of the present Venezuelan government? You talked a little bit about food sovereignty in Ljubljana, so could you comment on that a little bit more? And the second question is with regard to the Kornai and his notion of efficiency. He used this notion to basically criticize the real existence of socialism. So what would be the content of this notion of efficiency within the new socialist strategy or new socialist program? And how does this concept of efficiency relates to the other thing that you mentioned, the fairness? So what is the relationship or correspondence between efficiency and fairness in the new socialist program, the socialism for the 21st century?
Okay, macro problems, enormous, absolutely enormous. Many of them I may have mentioned. I can't remember anything. I can't remember if I said that in Ljubljana or not. But one of the serious problems has been a vastly overvalued, bolivar, and a resistance to that's the currency, and a resistance to bringing it, devaluing it to a level that it should be. So what are the implications of that? It means when you look at the articulated goals of the socialist economy for Venezuela, one of the first things, and it's in the Constitution, is food sovereignty. Now, food sovereignty is very difficult when you have an overvalued, currency, which means that, imports of food are much cheaper than anything anybody can produce in the land. So they try, they create socialist communes, they give lots of money to people to sort of, subsidize these activities, but, they're fighting against the fact that their own policy makes it extremely difficult. Socialist overvalued bolivar also means that the whole idea of escaping complete dependence on oil and by diversifying into other sectors is also thwarted, because you can't really diversify and develop new sectors, with an overvalued currency, because, again, easier to import, a lot of things. So many of their sectors, the industries they create, are industries which are, in many cases, they get a lot of support from China in establishing some industries like assembly of Chinese cars, Chinese basic cars to create a local car, assembly, at least to start with, of cell phones and and computers. But then they move in the whole process of moving in to produce these things themselves, because it's a transfer of technology is what they're concerned with. But they are fighting, against a lot of, problems of that kind. So that's one problem. Then, of course, there is the problem, of the things that, were inherited, from decades of, of the Dutch disease, et cetera, which, elevated the currency. There are very few peasants in the countryside. They left, because they couldn't function. They moved into the outsides of the cities. Excuse me. So one of the problems is the need to move people into the countryside. And Chavez was attempting constantly to encourage that. And part of that was many of his allo presidentes would take place on a successful commune, showing the houses that people were living in, which would be very appealing to people living, in shacks on the side of a hill, outside Caracas. He'd show this, then they had interviews and talk to people about their lives, etc. He was clearly trying to encourage a movement back to the land, which, is not easy. But and one of in fact, one of the documents I wrote at one point was to talk about how, what getting people back to the land really involved. The whole shift of a whole infrastructure of, to move effectively things that people identify as civilization to the countryside. You couldn't simply raise prices, or you couldn't simply just make it a better life, because it's not easy to get people to go back to the countryside. That's not unique to Venezuela. Cuba has a greater problem at this particular point with that same problem of an underpopulated countryside and importing 70% of its food. So does that do the macro problem? Yeah, and let me just say that if they devalued, and had a proper devaluation, not only would it, encourage, the development of local industry and local agriculture, but also by having, the bolivar, many more bolivars for every dollar of oil exports means that there would be much more spending power in the part of the state. It would, in fact, reduce state deficits, et cetera, allow for more spending on social, services and support for, local industry. So that's that part. Kornai and the notion of efficiency. Well, Kornai's focus, it is, while he does break in some ways with neoclassical theory, because he thinks of a system as a whole, which is, neoclassical theory doesn't do that, it just sort of builds up, from, individual maximizer to individual maximizer to have this wonderful Walrasian, equilibrium, which, you have to make a few assumptions to get to that. Kornai doesn't have that. Kornai, in fact, says you can't, you have to, a person who begins with a systems analysis recognizes that all these things about individual preferences, et cetera, are effects of the system, not the starting point. But on the other hand, not only Kornai, people like Bruce and Lasky and many of the people who were reformers, and Kornai was a reformer, as were Bruce and Lasky and many of the people, from Poland and many of the other, market economists, that they, it was disappointment, that drove them increasingly to see that the answer had to be the market. That there had to be, because the market was what generated efficiency. But, one of the problems is, again, the narrow definition of efficiency. One of the things I've been working on more sporadically, but hope to get, to, in the next year or so, is developing an alternative conception of efficiency, which talks about human beings being produced under, that every process of production is in fact simultaneously producing human beings. And that some processes of production, like production under capitalism, deform people, destroy them, cripple them in Marx's words. One would suggest should, if you think in terms of joint products, you'd want to say, well, that's a negative. You can add your sort of efficiency of the firm, but you then want to, recognize that there's a real negative. So my argument is that it's not the fairness that is missing from Kornai's argument. It's the lack of a focus on the human product of all activity. And that when you introduce that question, the kind of people who are producing themselves, then you get different concepts of efficiency. And I think I was telling you, one of the stories of China, was in China there were the state industries, and then there were the industries called collective industries, which were often created at the municipal level. And the state industries, it was concluded, were really inefficient and unprofitable compared to the collective industries. There was one interesting difference between the two, which was the state industries had the responsibility of having nurseries, having housing, having a whole series of social characteristics which were state policy. And so naturally their costs were higher than the collectives, but this point was completely forgotten about. They were just simply, the argument was the state industries are inefficient, we have to shut down the state industries. So that's because things, once you start, you have to decide, what are we measuring? And Kornai is just measuring, classic, way. But, it's not even, he's not measuring. All that is being said is arrangement A is inefficient, arrangement B is inefficient. And what is it inefficient from the perspective of the managers? The managers are, it is inefficient for the managers to have to, get their inputs directed through the plan, as opposed to being able to freely contract. It's inefficient for the managers to have to keep workers employed, even if they could cut them, if they could cut them the employment and do all these things. It's efficiency only from the perspective of the manager. So that's really what he's doing, and it's like here. during the period of self-management, where the managers felt it was really inefficient that they should have to be in these meetings with workers, in the workers' councils. It's a waste of time, that was their thing. But they had to. That was the rules under which they functioned, and did everything they could to undermine those rules.
Can you comment briefly on the political prospects for Maduro? There was recently this fight in the parliament, and the opposition is challenging the win. And last time on Subversive, you talked a little bit about the necessary requirements for the workers' self-management being something like short of working hours and self-education, education. So is there anything going on in Venezuela in these terms?
No. When discussions of worker management were happening, and then there was going to be a constitutional change which would lower the work week, lower the work day, we argued and wrote up stuff saying rather than lowering the work day and sending people home, what should happen is that the work day should be reduced, and during the time that reduction occurred, the remaining time, we're talking about a 6 hour of regular work, 2 hours of education in self-management, because that didn't happen here. People did not develop the skills to manage the enterprises, and the argument we were making is it's necessary to have education within the workplace. Chavez agreed, but it didn't happen that way in the motion, because there was a strong sentiment by traditional trade unionists that what was necessary was simply to have the time for leisure. And that was their perspective, and that was written basically in the bill. There's a new labor law that just came in, and that labor law, which was, I guess, is effective on the 7th of May. And that labor law has, it's nothing. It's nothing. I can't even talk about it. Anyway, so that links to Maduro, because Maduro has been linked all along to the traditional economistic trade unions. That's his background. That's who he worked with. He was opposed to worker management. So who knows, what will happen, in that respect as in this period. But he is not. He's not a person who is going to lead in the way that Chavez did in this area. As far as other things, about Maduro, I don't have a great, I don't think of him in the same way I think of Chavez. Let me put it that way. I just realized there's something, a camera here. But he's made some really interesting, he hasn't done very much, but he's made some very interesting cabinet appointments. And one of the things that is very interesting is the Ministry of the Communes has been an area of conflict because the last two ministers of that ministry have been very top-down oriented. Yeah, there must be communes. We want a commune in this area. It must fill the following, characteristics. And there's been a whole movement of communes from below, in which they have, been organizing really integrally, and it went from 16 communes from below initially. They were up to 80 the last count, and it was very interesting because Chavez, one of the last things he did at one of his open cabinet meetings was say, where are the communes? What's happening with the communes? They should be playing all this role, and we don't see them doing it. Maybe, where's the Minister of Communes wasn't there, and so he said, maybe we should get rid of the Ministry of Communes and make it a responsibility of everybody. And then a friend of ours, a woman who is one of the key activists in this movement of communes from below, immediately wrote an open letter to him, which I actually have the computer translation here. She immediately wrote an open letter saying, if you want to know, this is for Aparea, which is sort of a website which has a lot of the left criticism, left Chavez criticism and discussions, and you can get it online and just use a Google translator to get a sense of what happened, what the discussions are. But anyway, her article was called, "If you want to know where the communes are, Comrade Chavez, ask the people," and then saying, you can't ask the minister of the communes, you can't ask the governors, you can't even ask your party, because they say we're anarchists, we're this, et cetera, like that. A fantastic letter. So I don't know, whether that had any impact or not, but the new minister of communes is not who has been appointed by Maduro, and it might have been Chavez's desire to have him. He might have left that as a legacy. That the new minister of communes is a person closely linked to the communes from below, and that is the most exciting thing about what's happening there right now. Because I view the communes and the communal councils as really so central to the process there. As far as the fight in the House, in the National Assembly, I don't know what's happening there. I mean, it was not Maduro's decision that created the problem. The head of the National Assembly is this person, Diosdado Cabello, who was vice president way back, and is closely linked to the army, and is generally was seen as the competitor to Maduro. And he made the decision, but he may have run this by Maduro, he made the decision not to recognize any opposition person unless they recognize Maduro's election. And that created the whole process. He would ask, as an opposition person would raise their hands, to speak, he would say, do you recognize the president, that President Maduro has been legally elected? And they would say no. He said, well, you are going contrary to our Constitution. I deny you the right to speak. And that then created this whole growing tension in the National Assembly, which and then 2 days ago or 3 days ago, it went further because the microphones had been removed from the people who had who refused to accept Maduro as the president. So they came with klaxons and noisemakers, etc. You can see it online on YouTube. They came with all this noise making, etc., like that, that then and put up a banner, and that then led to the actual confrontation. But I don't know exactly the thing. The opposition has put up a picture of this whole thing, videos, but the government has the security cameras, and so they have the whole picture. But they don't. There are things that probably are left out of theirs as well. But anyway, it's a tenuous situation. I don't think there's any way that Capriles is going to be, anything's going to happen. I mean, the voting mechanism in Venezuela is pretty hard to screw around with, because you get a piece of paper, you put it into the machine, you then look to see that the machine recorded the same thing that you voted on, and then they do a sample at the end, of the whole voting process as to, do the papers and the machines, tally exactly, and it's not a tiny sample, it's 54%. I mean, that's a gigantic sample, a random sample of tables at the thing. So. But, I mean, all that's happening at this particular point is there to discredit Maduro internationally. That's the name of the game there. On the other hand, in some of the opposition websites are suddenly, calling for, we cannot play the game anymore. We've got to go into complete resistance. We have to go into clandestine activity, et cetera. Like that. These are people who are moderate opposition people, or have just really reacted to this whole process. I sent the comment to a friend of mine who worked very closely with us, Federico Fuentes, who is in Australia, and he just sent me the note back saying, "Good luck to them in the mountains." You know. Anyway.
We have time maybe for one more question, and we have a candidate already. So.
You cannot change social relations if you don't change the media, but you cannot change the media if you don't change society first. That sort of logical obstacle seems to puzzle quite a lot of political strategists. However, in Venezuela, as Kostanic just told me, most of the media outlets are owned by the opposition.
Yeah. No, yes. The ones that are widely spread, you know, the newspapers and television. Only one of the television stations is really crazy, really rabid. The others are sort of, you know, trying to be more neutral, but they're still opposition. Yeah, the opposition controls the main media. But there's something that, you know, when people sort of say all this, they forget that there's a whole other sector in the media, and that is local community media. And that has been really fostered throughout the whole country of support, you know, for local radio stations linked to particular communities. So those will be all stations and like, you know, mainly stations, I think, you know, which are and television as well as radio, which are reaching their local community. They're not national, but on the other hand, they are challenging the hegemony of the opposition press. So yeah. It's a hard thing. I mean, it's one of those things which is, if everything is connected, how can you change anything? You know, well, you find the weak points. You know, and in the case of media, I mean, there's a lot of media. A lot of people watch and read Aparea. It's a pro-Chavez Chavist website, and you know. That's a kind of thing that can challenge, you know, the capitalist media, because more and more people get their news not from capitalist media, but they get it through the web.
Okay, thank you. I believe Michael deserves a beer now for all of this. So,
Rakia.
or maybe even that. So those of you interested can, of course, continue the debates in an informal setting, but not, please don't be too aggressive. The man deserves some rest now. So thank you again, Michael.